A stray English arrow pierced William of Normandy's visor on the afternoon of October 14, 1066, and the conquest of England died with him. The Duke had been rallying his cavalry for a third feigned retreat, the tactic that all morning had drawn pockets of Harold's fyrd down the slope of Senlac Hill into Norman lances. Witnesses said the shaft came from nowhere, loosed from the English line as William raised his helm to be recognized. He pitched from the saddle into the trampled mud below the ridge. Word ran faster than horses. Within minutes, the cry passed through the Norman host that the Duke was slain, and what had been a careful, brutal assault collapsed into something older and uglier, men looking for the road back to the ships. For decades, historians of this timeline have debated whether the wound was instantly fatal or whether William lingered long enough to name a successor. The chroniclers disagree, as chroniclers always do. What is not disputed is the result. The shield wall held. The housecarls' axes did the rest as the sun went down over the Sussex weald. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Because the chain of consequence reaching outward from that single arrow would, within a century, redraw the map of Europe and reshape the very language in which this story is told. But what no one on that hilltop yet understood was how far the tremor would travel. Harold Godwinson did not sleep that night. The king who 20 days earlier had broken Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge now stood astride a second battlefield, and the discipline that had defined his reign reasserted itself before dawn. Gurth and Leofwine, his brothers and earls of East Anglia and Kent, gathered the housecarls who could still march and pressed south through the burned villages toward Hastings. The Norman remnant, knights without a duke, footmen without orders, sailors uncertain whether to wait or flee, broke against the harbour walls. The fortified camp fell within a day. Carts of plundered grain, papal relics, and the duke's body itself passed into English hands. The corpse was returned with cold courtesy. A handful of surviving barons, among them William Fitzosborne, were permitted to sail for Normandy with their lord wrapped in his own banner. Harold's instinct was political as much as Christian. A duke killed in battle could be mourned at Caen. A duke held hostage in London would have invited a second invasion. The king then turned north. By the Feast of All Saints, he was riding through the gates of London to bells and the singing of priests, and the Witan, which had elected him in January, confirmed him again in November. The Pope's banner, recovered from the Hastings camp, was quietly retired to a chapel at Waltham. Pope Alexander II in Rome said nothing for a long time. Across the Channel, the news arrived in stages, each worse than the last. Matilda of Flanders, William's widow, was a woman of formidable will, and she moved at once to secure Rouen for her eldest son. Robert Curthose was 13 years old. He was clever, charming, and entirely unready. Matilda governed in his name through the winter of 1066 and into the spring, summoning the Norman bishops and the loyalist barons of the Cotentin to swear fealty at the cradle of a child duke. For a few months it seemed she might hold. She could not. Geoffrey the Bearded of Anjou tested the southern frontier before the first thaw, and Conan II of Brittany, who had quarrelled bitterly with William while he lived, marched into the Avranches with a small army and the loud claim of an old grievance. Worse still, the great Norman families that had followed William to England returned home shorn of their promised English fiefs, hungry and resentful, and they did not all rally to Rouen. Some entered the service of Philip I of France, who watched from Paris with the patient interest of a man who has just seen a rival removed at no cost to himself. The duchy did not vanish, but it bled at every border, and by 1075 the lands of the Hiamois, the Bessin, and the Pays de Caux answered to different lords, several of whom paid homage in Paris. Harold turned, as Anglo-Saxon kings had turned for 2 centuries, toward the North Sea. Sweyn II Estridsson of Denmark was a kinsman of Harold's house through Knut's old dynasty, and he had threatened England himself in earlier years. Now, with Norman ambitions in ruins and Harold Hardrada's heirs licking their wounds in Norway, the two kings found their interests aligned. In 1068, Harold's niece, the daughter of Aelfgifu of Northumbria, was married to one of Sweyn's younger sons in a ceremony at Winchester attended by Danish jarls and English things alike. A treaty followed. Denmark renounced the old Scandinavian claim to the English crown. England recognized Danish primacy in the southern Baltic and pledged free passage through her ports. The agreement was not romantic. It was the cold arithmetic of two trading kingdoms with shared coasts and shared enemies. But it ended a century of Scandinavian invasion threats, and it bound the English crown to the herring fleets, the amber routes, and the timber yards of the north in ways that would prove far more durable than any French alliance the Normans might have brought. The consequences of that quiet treaty would unfold for generations. But first, the king had a kingdom to govern. Harold ruled for 19 more years, and he ruled in writing. The administrative machinery he had inherited from Edward, and before Edward, from Knut, was the most sophisticated in northern Europe. Shires, hundreds, sheriffs, and a chancery that issued writs in Old English on parchment sealed with red wax. He did not reinvent it, he expanded it. Royal writs began to appear in every shire court by the 1070s, and the body of customary law that scholars would later call the Laws of Harold codified the judgments of the Wessex kings in the vernacular tongue. Latin remained the language of the Church and of letters to Rome and to Constantinople, but the law of the land was English, written in English, read aloud in English to free men gathered at the 100 Moot. There was no harrying of the north. There were no castles thrown up in market towns to overawe restive populations. The great Anglo-Saxon cathedrals at Winchester, Canterbury, and York continued to rise in the Romanesque manner already underway before 166, but they rose under English masons and English bishops, and the parish churches around them kept their dedications to saints whose names a Wessex farmer could pronounce. With no Norman English realms straddling the Channel, the gravitational center of Western Francia shifted. Philip Fais, who had inherited the French crown as a child in 1060, lived to see the dismemberment of his most dangerous neighbor and the steady consolidation of the Ile-de-France. His son, Louis VI, would inherit a royal demesne that touched the Seine from Paris nearly to the sea. Pieces of old Normandy, Evreux, parts of the Vexin, the lower Seine valley, came into the Capetian orbit through marriage, purchase, and the occasional small war. The county of Anjou rose to fill the vacuum on the western seaboard. Fulk of Fife and his successors absorbed Maine and pressed into the Cotentin, and by 1100 the Angevin counts were the most formidable lords in Atlantic France. Flanders prospered too, its cloth towns trading freely with English wool merchants, whose ships now sailed under Harold's son and grandson. The Channel, instead of becoming a single political waterway as it nearly had been, returned to what it had always been, a busy frontier between two distinct worlds. When Pope Urban II preached the cross at Clermont in November 1095, no son of William rode east at the head of a great Norman army. There was no Bohemond of Taranto, because there was no Norman conquest of southern Italy on the scale the real history recorded. The Hauteville brothers, deprived of the patronage and prestige that an English conquest had brought their cousins, remained one warlord clan among several in Apulia. The First Crusade still marched. Raymond of Toulouse led the Provençals, Godfrey of Bouillon led the Lotharingians, Hugh of Vermandois carried the banner of the French king's brother. They reached Antioch and then Jerusalem, and the Holy City fell in the summer of 1099 to a coalition that looked recognizably similar to ours, but thinner at sea and slower in its arrival. A small English-Danish company traveled with them. It was led by one of Harold's younger sons, who had taken the cross more from piety than from politics, and it was remembered chiefly for the seamanship of its longships in the eastern Mediterranean. The Crusader states that emerged were poorer, more fragile, and shorter-lived. And then came the moment that would define everything that followed, the slow, quiet realization across the 12th century of what the world had become. By 1130, an educated traveller walking from Bruges to York to Roskilde to Bergen could conduct his business in tongues that, though distinct, remained mutually intelligible to a patient ear. English had evolved, languages always do. It had absorbed Norse vocabulary from generations of Danish merchants, a scattering of Latin from the church and the technical terms of trade from Flanders. But it had not been displaced from the courts of justice or the rolls of the chancery. The poetry of Alfred's court and the prose of Knut's writs still ran, recognizably, beneath the speech of London apprentices and Yorkshire shepherds. Normandy, reduced to a duchy of middling rank, looked east toward Paris and south toward Anjou for its quarrels, and its lords spoke a French that owed nothing to England. The Plantagenets, who in another timeline would have ruled an empire from the Tweed to the Pyrenees, here remained counts of Anjou with ambitions limited by the Loire. The Channel was a trading sea, not a dynastic one. The herring boats outnumbered the warships. Nothing in this world was simpler than ours, or kinder, or freer. There were famines and bad kings and plagues, and the long Germanic shore had its wars like every shore. But the arrow that found William's visor on Senlac Hill on an October afternoon in 1066 had bent the river of history into a different channel, and the water, having found its bed, ran on. Sometimes a single shaft, loosed from a tired bow at the end of a long day, decides the language a continent will speak for 1,000 years.